everyone. Good morning and welcome. I am Keren Yarhi-Milo. I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs and the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations. I am so excited to be hosting Rajiv Shah at SIPA's Institute of Global Politics. Welcome. As you will hear, Raj's message of embracing a big bets mindset is a hopeful one. It is also one that Secretary Clinton and I have taken to heart when we launched IGP. We both saw, like Raj, an urgent need for new leadership approaches to complex problem solving, whether in the field of philanthropy, academia, the private sector, or policy making. To tackle the challenges of our time, we have to move beyond playing it safe, thinking conventionally, or relying on incremental approaches. Instead, we have to be creative and devise cutting-edge solutions that span disciplines. And in order to scale fast, organizations, as you will learn, need to be comfortable with failure. Raj Shah gives us a playbook in line with this ethos. He gives us tools of how leaders can lead their organizations to have greater impact. Here at IGP and SIPA, that has meant bringing scholars together with practitioners and breaking them out of their silos. Thinking local to global in how we approach these problems and engaging with our ideological rivals to reach greater consensus and modeling civil discourse for the next generation of leaders. As a dean of a public policy school, indeed the largest public policy school and the most global one, I know a lot of us pay lip service to the idea of thinking big. You can find countless leadership books out there, but our speaker today walks the walk, and he has taken really bold steps every day of his impressive career. Raj wrote an excellent book, and I highly recommend it, and I look forward to the conversation. What I like about his book is it's an emphasis on forging unlikely alliances to solve big problems. He emphasizes the importance of creating diverse teams, and he makes sense of why many leaders are resistant to change or stubbornly cling to outdated, ineffective methods. His discussion about leadership and decision-making is something I focus on in my own work on political psychology. We know that leaders tend to take bigger risks when they perceive themselves to be in a domain of losses. If any of you taking the classes that we teach with Secretary Clinton, we also know that bringing in the more opposing views can help us avoid groupthink. However, for most leaders, this does not come naturally, which is why the lessons from this book, are such a helpful guide for current and future leaders like yourselves. And I wish I had read this book myself several years ago. And thank you, Raj, for writing it. All right, and speaking of great leaders, I now have the pleasure of introducing Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. As I've said countless times, we are so thrilled to have her here as a professor at SIPA. Probably you're getting sick of hearing this, but we will continue to say this. And besides being a former Secretary of State and Senator from the great state of New York, she's also the chair of the Institute of Global Politics Faculty Advisory Board, and this event is sponsored by IGP. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Well, thank you so much, Keren, as always. And I've got to tell you, this is a special treat for me, not only because I love the fact that IGP is sponsoring this, but because I get to introduce Raj. And More than a decade ago, I had the pleasure of recommending to President Obama that he nominate Raj Shah to the position of the administrator of USAID. And that came about because my team and I at the State Department were working on new ways of trying to deal with hunger and create more sustainable food production. And we were looking for good advice from throughout the U.S. government as well as from outside. And Raj represented the Department of Agriculture in our early conversations about, how do we get beyond, to go to Keren's point, a big idea for helping the world feed itself instead of just providing emergency aid on an ongoing basis whenever the system broke down. And immediately, Raj was such a constructive participant in our conversation. And so when I observed him and worked with him, I thought, this is the kind of leader and thinking that we need at USAID. And in that role, he demonstrated many of the lessons from the book that we are here to talk about today. It takes an exceptional person to walk into an enormous job of any kind with their eyes wide open and to embrace the multitude of challenges that at that time our country faced in development, and also to keep their optimism and their positive energy in trying to tackle them. But I have seen Raj meet each challenge with determination and bold leadership. He truly does have an unwavering belief, which, sometimes seemed a little out of sync with reality. But he has an unwavering belief that anything is possible, and that, if we just thought about it right, worked on it together, we could turn that belief into real results. So you'll read in the book, during his remarkable career, he has organized relief and development campaigns in places like Haiti and Afghanistan, helped to curb an Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and now as the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, he has put together $1 billion over the next 5 years to address climate change, and I hope in his conversation with Keren, he'll tell us a little bit more about that. One of the things that I hope we can really imbue into IGP and SIPA is this idea that we can tackle and solve problems, because given all the problems in the world right now, as we know so well, they seem almost unbelievably impossible, but they're not. But it doesn't mean that they are easy to solve. It doesn't mean that it doesn't take enormous patience and effort to get the people in the room and keep them in the room who have a role to play in helping us to solve them, to form unlikely partnerships to meet our biggest challenges. So I'm looking forward to the conversation between our dean and Raj as they tell us more about how large-scale change really happens. Thank you all.
This is my copy, and as you can see, there's a lot that I took notes from myself as I'm trying to figure out how to lead this school. So a lot of great things to say, to talk about here, and we can, we will have time to talk about a few. We will open it up for Q&A, and you will submit your questions on cards. But let's start with the title, Big Bets. For those here who have not read the book yet, can you give us a vivid example, perhaps drawing from your own work in Rockefeller, from your own time in government, what those big bets look like and what they're about?
Well, Keren, it's amazing and wonderful to be with you, and thank you, and I absolutely can. But first, I just want to say thank you to Secretary Clinton. I think in this room it's Professor Clinton, for that kind introduction and for, frankly, taking a big bet on me. and giving me the opportunity to serve in this country and around the world. And so much of what's in here, and she won't want me to keep referencing it, are things I've learned just being in the orbit of one of history's most amazing leaders. And so how many of you here, by show of hands, have taken the Secretary's course yet? Oh my, good, okay, all right. So that's great. You're in for an extraordinary treat, and I think you'll be surprised in so many amazing ways that someone who has done everything she's done maintains such an openness and a kindness. I was actually, when Hillary called me, I was at my desk at the Department of Agriculture, and I got there early in the morning. I used to have a little Vespa. I came from Seattle, and I would park it like right out front with all the big black SUVs at the Department of Agriculture. And I'd get there early. I was alone at my desk, and my BlackBerry, back then we had BlackBerries, rang, and she said, "Is this Raj?" And I said, "Yes." She's like, "This is Hillary Clinton." And I kind of looked, and I was like, "No, it's probably not. Someone's playing a joke on me." And that's how the USAID adventure started. So anyway, I'm thrilled to be here. Look, big bets are exactly what you think they are. They are efforts to actually solve and not just make piecemeal improvements in tackling the biggest challenges we face. And too often, right now, as the Secretary said, but also over the last years, it's just too easy to think because addressing hunger is sort of seen as doing good, let's not systematically try to solve widespread hunger. Let's provide aid when we can and feel good about what we did. And you should feel good, but feeling good is not good enough. And when this country has been at our best, and when our community and those of you that are studying in this field have been in our best, it's when we've actually tried to solve problems at scale. And an example, a vivid example, is the Ebola crisis in West Africa. If you remember back to 2014, around this time in 2014, Ebola was out of control. We had there was a 70% mortality rate. It's a hemorrhagic fever, so people were bleeding out of their eyes and ears as they were passing away. In 3 West African countries, the mortality rate, as I noted, was more than 70%. And we really didn't know exactly, on a scientific basis, exactly how to solve that problem. What we did know is that healthcare workers in Liberia had 75+% of them had lost their lives over the course of the summer because they were treating people with Ebola without proper protective equipment. And what we did know is that the NGO leaders couldn't send and deploy their teams safely into Liberia. So President Obama made a big bet and said, I'm going to send US military personnel to try to create a safe enough environment so that the humanitarian sector can get back on its legs and fight Ebola. And by the way, it was October because it was leading up to an election. Donald Trump was on the airways accusing us of taking undue risks with the lives of American soldiers. The New Jersey governor was turning facilities near the airport into quarantine sites. It was just, and the science was gone from the public debate. It was all politics. And so that was a big bet. Right. But what happened was we got on the ground, we listened to local communities, a group called Local Communities, Global Communities, a longstanding USAID partner, had been working in communities for decades, and they actually invented the solution. They talked to families and they found out people were transmitting Ebola mostly by kissing, washing, and respecting the bodies of the deceased. And it was mostly women and girls, and it was mostly in rural communities. And so they came up with a way to send safe burial teams in full protective equipment with WHO certified body bags in a ceremonially appropriate way to respect and honor tradition, but to remove those bodies before they were washed and redressed and people could have more contagion. And contagion went way down. Instead of 1.6 million cases, which was the CDC estimate, we had 30,000. And it turns out Ebola never really hit our shores. And that's a big bet that worked. And it worked because people had courage to do the right thing and because we were determined not just to do some good to help others, but to solve a problem completely.
No, that's a great example. So I don't know if this was in the call that you just mentioned, that she said this is Hillary Clinton, but she did appoint you as administrator of USAID. So tell me a little bit about that moment, how it felt like. Do you feel like you were ready to lead at that moment?
Well, knowing about your scholarship, I get nervous about just answering these questions without giving them a lot of thought. So I had been working with an outstanding group of leaders that the Secretary brought together, including an economist named Steve Radelet, an amazing lawyer named Cheryl Mills, and a whole really talented team to think through what American development policies should look like. So I felt ready to lead. I really did, and I really wanted that opportunity. I just didn't know it was available. And what was interesting is, had I known all the things I got to know a year later, I probably wouldn't have been ready to lead. Had I known, that you also lead the large-scale humanitarian response that involves leading military assets in the midst of Port-au-Prince during a tragic earthquake. Like there were enough unknowns that on the stuff I knew, I was like, oh, I got this. But there were plenty of things I didn't know, including how to work with Congress. And there's a chapter in the book about my education on how to work with Congress, including how to engage with foreign leaders in a certain way as a representative of the U.S. government. And I write about that a little bit as well, about knowing who you're betting on as an important component of making big bets. So yeah, I felt confident, but in retrospect, that confidence was because I really wasn't fully aware of what the task at hand required.
Right, and that is a typical.
Is that okay?
Yes,
all right,
yes,
I got it.
That's very good.
I'm sitting here with the world's foremost scholar on political psychology, and I want to get this right.
Hardly. But a related thing, I mean, having overconfidence, or maybe, that's also normal. But the flip side is imposter syndrome. And let me talk a little bit about that. Have you felt at any point that you were not prepared for something? You were asked to lead the U.S. government's response to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti just 1 week, right, after you took the job at USAID. That's remarkable. And when you walked into the Oval Office, and that's an anecdote I really like from the book, for the first crisis response meeting, you overheard then Vice President Biden asking President Obama whether he was sure about you leading the effort, or whether there'd be somebody better better off with someone with more experience. So we talk in our class about the role of experience and how it affects crisis decision making, and you have a really good example of what it's like to be with not a lot of experience facing a crisis so early on in your career.
Well, that is an anecdote in the book. I'll say the night of the Haiti earthquake, the earthquake happened around 5 o'clock in the evening. President Obama called me on my BlackBerry, and I got a call, and they said the White House is calling, and the president wants to speak to you. And USAID at that point had no other political appointees. We were really behind on getting our appointees approved. And so a friend of mine, one of my aides, said, Raj, the president's going to call you. And I looked at my BlackBerry, and it had like 1 or 2 bars. And I thought, oh, no. So we put a desk up by the window of the Ronald Reagan building, which if you've been that building has these huge brick walls, and finally got some coverage. The president called, had a very short conversation, said, I'm putting you in charge of this response and make us proud. And I'd taken a notepad out because I was going to write down presumably the instructions I was going to get. And then the phone went dead. And I thought, oh my gosh, because of my BlackBerry only having 2 bars, I screwed up my first and only call with the President of the United States. And sure enough, he had just hung up. And he then walked, and about a minute later, he was on CNN from the situation, from the press room in the White House, and he said, "I just spoke to Administrator Shah, and I've instructed him to do," and he had all these instructions, the Coast Guard and the U.S. military, and we're going to do it. And I thought, okay, then I started writing down, like, this is how this works. So then that evening, actually the next evening, that evening, there were a series of meetings called, in the NSC structure, called a Deputies Committee, a Principals Committee, and then a National Security Council when the President joins. So I sat through these meetings and muddled through them. In fact, I was sitting across, I don't know why, Hillary, they put me in this seat, but I was sitting across from Mike Mullen and Bob Gates, like at the front of the table, because, I was in charge. Yeah. And I had my little note cards, and I'd written out the instructions and stuff, and we really did need these C-130 aircraft to get these urban search and rescue teams going. And by the way, we had a very talented team, so it's just a matter of processing information quickly. And when I asked them for the C-130s, the ink was smudged on the side, and so I write about this in the book. I said C-13s in front of like everybody, including the secretary, and nobody corrected me. It was all cool, and sure enough, we got the C-130s, and
when
we got
you
our
realized that you made a mistake,
I was terrified, but I just rolled with it. So the next morning, we go into the Oval for a briefing, and I was early. And I walk in, and it's exactly the conversation they were having. And the conversation was Vice President Biden pointing out that Craig Fugate, who ran FEMA, was an exceptionally qualified leader who has run many humanitarian responses. And to Craig's great credit, we then got in the meeting, and then Hillary came, and everybody showed up. We all sat down and had a proper briefing. After the meeting, Craig came up to me and said, "Raj, I'm happy to help in any way." And our approach was open the turnstiles. That's the title of the chapter. We actually convinced USAID's security team to keep physically the barriers open so people could come and go in those early days. And Craig ended up partnering with one of our USAID command leaders and stayed in our command center for the next 3 months and just worked seamlessly with our team. And so for those of you that have this impression that government is about bureaucratic fighting and people want to have these turf war things, I'll say that that's definitely true. You see a lot of that in government, but moments where there are so many moments where mission trumps that behavior. And my advice to you is, as you grow your careers, kind of learn how to harness that mission to get the best out of others. There's no better person to teach that than Professor Clinton, but it literally is the leadership opportunity to say, look, right now we're trying to save lives and frankly show that America's power could be used for moral purpose in the world, and do that with real conviction. And it brought people together across boundaries, in government they call them equities, across different parts of the organizations, and across civil and military in a way that I thought was very special.
This is great, such great insight. And let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned some successes and things that you got right. You were also, in our class, the students are asked to write postmortem on things that, decisions that in retrospect, turned out to be great ones, but also mistakes and failures. And you've been in rooms with many leaders. So from your own experience or from observing others in the room, what can you tell us about the most common mistakes leaders make and what type of learning you've seen or you recommend?
Well, I can only tell you from my own mistakes, which happen to be prolific. But there was a time in the second term in the Obama administration, we created an initiative called Power Africa. And the effort was designed to bring low-cost, largely renewable electrification to large communities in Africa. And it came right out of a summit President Obama had with President Xi, where they had at Sunnylands, where they had decided if they could do something big together in the spirit of global development, it showed that these emerging powers could collaborate for good. And I don't know how this fully got read into my mind, but one of the big things we tried to do is build a project called the Inga Dam. It would have been this massive hydropower dam, would have provided 40 gigawatts of power, would have provided enough sustainable power for 250 million people in Africa at about 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and it would have resulted in the carbon impact equivalent of taking about a third of the US auto fleet off the road. So we thought this was great. We'd raised billions of dollars from partners, including the Chinese. We'd created a structure for it. And I just sort of pursued it with the speed and optimism that I try to maintain through even tough contexts. But I had some blinders on, and they were mostly, the title in the book chapter is called Know Who You're Betting On, because I hadn't really mapped out the politics of who mattered in a way that took on very directly that there were going to be some big roadblocks. So one big roadblock was someone who became a great supporter and an unbelievable leader, Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who was just not a supporter of hydropower. And the person who led his effort in this area wasn't going to be convinced, and that he's the Senate Appropriations Chair. You're not going to get very far on a big project if you don't win over the people who matter. The other person who mattered deeply was Joseph Kabila, at the time the president of the DRC. And I had been working very closely with the prime minister of the DRC, who was a technocrat and spoke our language, had 3 young kids like I did at the time. We really got along. And everyone, had checked him out, and he was clean and transparent, and so we got a lot of work done. But at one point, President Kabila reached out and said, if you want to do this, you got to only work with me and only work with, I write in the book, through the Hotmail account and with a particular individual that he designated who had quite a reputation, and it just became clear the project was dead on arrival. And so I think really thinking through the politics of who you're dealing with and tackling that on the front end of projects and collaborations is really important.
And staying with this for a second, so we talk about mistakes and how you learn, but how, more broadly even, when you've been in these discussions and negotiations in multiple rooms on many occasions, we're trying to teach the students here how to approach those negotiations with an open mind, building, bridges, coalitions, listening to others. You talk a lot about this in the book, and how that process helps craft policies that are sound at the end.
Well, that brings to mind 2 types of negotiations.
Right.
One was we would all as a team negotiate either on the secretary's behalf or with her in the room with counterpart governments, right? And for that, you get quite a lot of structure and preparation, and there's a lot of discipline that's usually brought to that exercise. The other type of negotiation was working with Congress. And it became clear, I think, to the whole team that we were only going to make progress if we could get these projects really approved through Congress. And so the big effort we worked on called Feed the Future to reinvest in agriculture as opposed to just providing food aid. At a time, remember, after the 2008 food, fuel, and financial crisis, 100 million people have been pushed back into poverty. The cover of The Economist had a picture of a young girl eating what they called mud cakes, but they would take grain and mix it with mud so that there was slightly more satiety, and that was a girl in Port-au-Prince. So we constructed this project together. Right. It was a whole of government effort. It was really quite well designed, and it was succeeding. And then the Tea Party Republican election of 2010 happened, and the very first bill that they proposed after that election was called House Bill H.R. 1, would have basically zeroed out the budget for USAID and shut down the agency. So I thought, okay, I know how to handle this, and I had my team do all this math, and I went to Congress, and I testified, and I said, well, the Republican budget will kill 70,000 kids. And I detailed it out, like immunization programs, malaria programs, maternal child transmission for HIV/AIDS, all the things that would just shut down immediately. And I was pretty proud of myself, and I got back, and I started getting positive notes from like-minded administration colleagues. And then Tom Vilsack called. And Tom said, Raj, I saw your testimony because it got a lot of attention. Right. And he said, I was just with Speaker Boehner, and he's incredibly upset and offended by what you said. And he has a faith-based community of leaders he's worked with over a long time to support this work, and you need to get up there and talk to him right away. So I got up there, met with him and his chief of staff named Barry Jackson, apologized. They gave me a list of people to go see. And over 6 to 8 months, I got to know on a very personal basis,
Yes.
a group of, very conservative Republican senators and House members. And over time, I joined their prayer breakfast, the Senate prayer breakfast, and they even asked me to deliver the national prayer breakfast speech one year. And I think Secretary Clinton delivered that as well in the past. And so, to me, the lesson is you got to get to know leaders on a personal basis. If you watched Hillary in those days, I think Lindsey Graham actually got in trouble for this in one of his campaigns, but one of our Feed the Future events, we had scheduled Lindsey and Hillary right after each other, and as they walked by each other, they sort of had a light embrace. And the minute you walked off, you're like, that's going to cost him. And then sure enough, during one of his primary campaigns, that became an ad. And I said, Feed the Future is running in South Carolina as a TV ad. And who would have thought? But we did a lot of outreach, and it was very personal. And we prayed together. And I learned that even people like Jim Inhofe, who put a snowball in his hand on the floor of the Senate to show climate change wasn't happening, but he had a deep passion for fighting poverty. He had adopted a young Ethiopian girl from a family that couldn't feed her. And he was just an extraordinary partner in getting the legislation passed. And when it was passed, the Global Food Security Act was passed on a bipartisan basis. It was the second largest piece of global development legislation since World War II, and only after the PEPFAR program in terms of its scale and its impact. And that program has been reauthorized twice, and it was used most recently to support the Black Sea grain deal that helped alleviate hunger and the food crisis we've been living through in the last 15, 16 months. So these things can be successes, but you got to make it personal.
Yeah, and I'm glad you emphasize this also in the book. This is a theme that comes up not just in the discussions about IGP and what we're trying to do here, but also in the class we're teaching about the importance of face-to-face diplomacy and how that matters a lot. So let's shift gears a little bit. Now you're the head of Rockefeller Foundation. Nonprofit philanthropic sector fits into the process that you are describing here, I assume. Would love to hear specifically what is the Rockefeller Foundation's role, or the roles of philanthropy more generally, in crafting smarter, effective solutions to those policy problems you're describing here?
Well, first I should put it in perspective. Philanthropy is a pretty small part of our society. We have a $100 trillion global economy. I think global philanthropy is about $850 billion. So it's a very small share. And within that, only about 6% of that goes to climate change. Only about less than 10% all in goes to kind of global poverty-oriented efforts and health. So, and most of that comes from a small set of big institutions. Rockefeller's one, the Gates Foundation's one. There are about probably 25 institutions that drive much of that spending. So, in my view, philanthropy is at its best when we are society's risk capital. When we say, we're going to help set the goals for what we should achieve together as a planet, and then we're going to invest for the long run, because frankly, we can kind of take some hits and still be there, and we can take a 20 or 30 year view. I didn't, by the way, invent this approach. I call it big bets, but John D. Rockefeller Sr. called it scientific philanthropy when he created the institution in 1913 with 2% of American GDP, and before there was an income tax for which to get an income tax deduction. And it was an incredible idea, because the idea was, where could science and innovation really lift everybody up at scale? And they decided health and agriculture would be those areas. In the last few years, we've added energy as the main focus. And there's a chapter in the book on our energy effort, but it is really now possible there are about 1 billion people that live around the world and consume less energy than having one light bulb and one appliance running for the course of a year. And it is now possible to reach that community through largely quasi-commercial, small-scale businesses that are providing power from distributed renewable electricity sources like solar, grid, battery systems. And we started this effort about a decade ago in India. They innovated and got the price point down dramatically.
Right.
We scaled it up with partners like the Bezos Earth Fund and the IKEA Foundation. The three of us each put $500 million into, so we raised about $1.5 billion. And then on the backs of that, we've raised about another $10 billion from development finance institutions. So we have about $11.5 billion, and we're active in 22 countries, working to put energy storage on grids so that countries have energy storage and can take renewable energy, and working to expand access dramatically. And I will tell you, I am a naive optimist over and over and over again. This is awesome. I mean, we do a partnership together with SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. I visited, and I know Secretary Clinton did too, these salt flats where these women are working in unbelievable conditions just to keep their families afloat out in these deserts, and switching them from diesel at 60 or 70 cents a kilowatt hour to solar, which after you get over the initial capital cost is basically free, changes everything for their income. They go from making $1 a day to making $3, $4 a day, and all of a sudden they can send kids to school. It's just transformational. And if you think about it in big picture terms, the Industrial Revolution over 200 years never really reached everybody. It just didn't. There are 3.6 billion people on Earth that consume less energy than 1,000 kilowatt hours per year, which Ernie Moniz would say is the productive minimum for society. And so I think if done right, the fight against climate change and an absolute focus on getting renewable electricity to everybody can actually address poverty and development in a way that's pretty profound. And I'll tell you, when world leaders, when I see Prime Minister Modi understands it, President Hichilema in Zambia, once they see that link, they're all in on trying to make that happen.
I agree, and it's really great that the Rockefeller is doing this with what is it, $1 billion recent commitment to climate change.
Yeah, and then we made another commitment on top of that.
On top of that, really wonderful. So we have time for one more question, and we open it up for Q&A. So we have about 50 or 60% of our students go into jobs in the government and the NGO sectors. And I want your advice is not the typical one or the traditional advice you would get or you would get from people who spend some time in the government. So what would be your? I mean, it's in the book. So what is your advice for our students who are seeking careers in government and the NGO, civil society?
Well,
what would you recommend?
I have two. I just met with a smaller group of students back there, and so I adapt my answer to offer two thoughts. The first is, you are the people that need to stay positive, aspirational, and ambitious. And too often in NGOs and governments, but let's face it, I mean, go walk into a big company too. It's not like everybody there is, we're going to transform the world doing X, Y, Z. So, but you have to be the people who are dreaming big and maintaining these bold aspirations for change, even in light of the day-to-day barrage of public information that can make one cynical. Because, if not you, who? Right. You're at this institution, you have these professors around you, you're going to get every job offer you seek, basically, when you come out of here. And you are. I mean, it's just your reputation now, right? So I feel like, you're the ones we're counting on to be really positive and optimistic and bold in how you approach things. I'd say the second thing for me, I have not done a book before. And writing this book has taught me to be deeply appreciative of the people I've learned from. So you can tell, obviously, I've learned a ton from Secretary Clinton. But I also write about time with Bill and Melinda Gates, like right when they were trying to figure out the foundation in its earliest days. I talk about people like Molly Melching, a extraordinary NGO leader in West Africa who's convinced thousands of villages to end the practice of female genital cutting by being with those tribal leaders and getting to know them. And I just look across, I feel so fortunate that I've gotten to learn from so many different types of people. I would urge you, as you make those job choices, to be as disciplined about who you're going to learn from as what your job title is and what you think you're going to do. Because especially early in your career, learning how to think about these things and learning how to interact with others around these issues is just as important, I think, as what you actually do, and that learning comes from who you get to surround yourself with.
That's great, Raj. Okay, so now we have questions from the audience, and I'm reading it. I'll try to read the handwriting. I mean, bear with me. When you face resistance against the bets you propose, how do you persuade stakeholders and lead, especially in the energy access and climate change space? That's a great question.
Well, that is a great question. Look, first, remember, you don't always have to convince everyone.
Right.
I mean, that's why my Inga Dam story, I hope you take away. You kind of have to map who do you really need to convince to join you and when. And I made a big mistake in my early mapping of that, because I thought, okay, if I prove this and that, everyone's just going to sign on. And especially on energy and climate, you find there's just a lot of divisiveness on this issue politically. Mm-hmm. And I would urge you to kind of avoid the divisiveness, figure out how to connect personally with people you need, and get them alongside. You know, the time with Jim Inhofe walking on farms in Ethiopia taught me he wouldn't want to talk about climate change the way I might. But when we were listening to farmers and they're like, hey, it's hotter every year and it's drier every year and I have less food for my family, we need more help, he will lead the charge to authorize the legislation to get Feed the Future codified into law. And so you don't often need everyone to agree with everything you think you know. You just need them to do things that are aligned with you. And I think that takes getting to know people. If there's one thing I wish I'd known earlier when I started in government was, I know this sounds obvious in retrospect, but like Congress is really important, and getting to know members of Congress on a personal basis actually was the thing that unlocked a little more possibility for us.
Yeah, I believe that. So another question for a member of our audience. Solving problems often has to do with developing economies. How do you ensure representation or involvement of these actors themselves in your proposed solutions?
Well, again, I think it's about who you're surrounding yourself with and who you're connecting to. We did a little book event at the Rockefeller Foundation this morning, and there was a leader named Kennedy Odoide there. And Kennedy has started this amazing organization called Shining Hope for Communities in Kibera slum in Kenya, but has spread it all across the nation and reaches millions of people. And during one of the many political confrontations around a Kenyan election years ago, we gave Kennedy some money, and he said, I'm going to give all these young men that are lining up to like acquire and unpack machetes, I'm going to give them all $5, and I'm going to make them ambassadors for peace. And he did it. He walked through the community, and he absolutely did it. And they all had this sticker that said they're ambassadors for peace. And there was shockingly less violence than people expected in yet another contested Kenyan election. And it was because of people like that that are on the ground. So I feel like you have to balance the sort of analytic stuff I talk about in the book with finding the Molly Melchings and the Kennedy Odoides and the others, and then finding an opportunity to do that. You know, when we traveled with Secretary Clinton, almost everywhere we went, she would always do a roundtable discussion or a larger discussion with young women. We went to Pakistan together easily a half dozen times, and every single time she would do that. And, you know, I don't think that's common for most secretaries of state. I think it was a mindset around, I'm going to learn from everybody, and I have a lot to learn. And the best leaders I've worked with, Secretary Clinton, Bill Gates, I mean, they are constantly trying to learn from others in ways that set the bar pretty high, and then you just try to emulate that example.
And humility is very important. All right, we have time for last questions, and that's the one I have in front of me. The rest of you, I'm sorry, we don't have time to get to all of them. So, what was the most challenging part of your job at USAID, and what's your example of working across the aisle to get things done? Well, I think you gave examples, but what was, let's leave it with that. What was the most challenging part, if you can look back?
You know, the most challenging part was actually personal. We had our third child,
Oh, wow.
I think, just after I started, and I remember going on a big trip to India with President Obama, 3 days after Jaisal was born. And the hardest parts were personal. It just, you know, you'd work around the clock. I still feel I missed a lot of my oldest son's, you know, window of time when he was young. And so I try to make up for that now, but you can only make up so much. In fact, you really can't make it up because they don't let you. Because they've grown up and they don't want to hang out anymore. But also personal in the sense that you're out there. And so you're critiqued all the time. Right. And almost everything we did that I was proud of, we also got criticized for. And I remember the first few times, again, I didn't intend to keep coming back to Secretary Clinton, but the first few times, I remember during that Haiti earthquake, a member of Congress who I deeply admired but never knew issued a press release that I should be removed from my job.
Yeah.
I had no idea why. I was so confused. We were sleeping in the office. We were managing a big sieve mill effort to get water into Port-au-Prince. It was wild. And I'm like, what on earth did I do? And we dug it up. And I remember sitting in the Secretary's office, and she's like, just go meet with him and it'll go away. And sure enough, I did the meeting. Is this super public, this event? It is, right? Well, I'll tell you, I did the meeting.
Yes, there are cameras.
Okay, fair enough. I'll just say, I did the meeting, and what that member wanted was for me to, they wanted me to meet a contractor who wanted a contract in Haiti. And I thought, you could have just asked for a meeting, you know, as opposed to issuing a press release, and then I did that. And so, and that just seemed to go on and on. Even the very first article that was written about my response to Haiti was this unbelievably positive piece in the Washington Post, just littered with quotes. Clearly the White House was nervous that I was like new. So they were all over the quotes saying how smart I was and data driven and this and that. So I read the article and I was like, hey, it turns out I'm doing a great job. And then I scrolled down and saw the commentary underneath it, and it was so personal and racist and mean and vitriol. And I just thought, this is crazy. And you just got to be prepared, I think. US aid is not like an elected position, but anything you do that ruffles feathers, that you're doing things differently, you're aspiring to do more, you're gonna take some hits. And I've sat behind closed doors with Secretary Clinton when she said, just tough it out. This is part of leadership. And I would suggest the same is true for all of you as you go on to whatever it is you do. There will be times when you will feel like you're just getting beaten up. And that's a part of leadership.
Oh, yeah. I believe me, and sitting here today, I really sympathize with what you're
Well,
saying.
deans have the toughest jobs,
deans
right?
have toughest jobs, and in times of crisis, they have even a tougher job. And the toughen up thing is something that you wrote an excellent book.
Thank you.
And I am
you
so
very
glad
much.
that you wrote it. And this is a perfect audience for this book. I highly recommend this. There's a lot to learn. Even somebody who studies leadership, expert in, on the psychology of leaders, there's a lot that I've learned from this, and I know that I will adopt in my own attempts to lead this school. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for taking those questions and being so honest in how you responded. Wonderful to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. What a wonderful discussion. I hope that worked.